There, let's record this. There's this thing called the Rails Doctrine. I was looking for kind of topical or atopical Rails study group to do, and came across this. And I think what can be a stumbling block sometimes for people is when they don't kind of understand what or how Rails works, I guess, or the kind of the design decisions behind Rails and what makes up Rails. Rails is super powerful, but it's also very opinionated in how it does things. And this document, I guess it's called document, explains kind of the decisions and why things were done and why they still are done and such. So I thought it'd be cool to go through this. Feel free to shout out, throw things into the chat. I don't have much besides going through this document with you guys and seeing if you have questions or comments or thoughts or what you think about the opinions that will be presented here. This is by a guy named, and I'm probably going to say it wrong because he's Dutch, I believe, David Heinemeier Hansen. Everybody that I've ever talked to who references him calls him DHH. That's also his Twitter handle. It's at DHH, the 3 letters. So I think that's because everybody knows his name is hard to pronounce. And he is the creator of Ruby on Rails. He's also a partner in Basecamp, which is a very successful project management software. Formerly 37 Signals was the company, but they decided to stop building multiple products and concentrate on that one. Basecamp is a Ruby on Rails product. From the story that I understand, DHH created Ruby on Rails because there wasn't something to build the software for the company that he was trying to create or was a partner in. So you'll also see, if you keep up with Rails releases and things like that, a lot of Rails features come from Basecamp. So a developer at Basecamp they'll want to add a feature or they'll want to add something and they can't do it with Rails. So they'll figure out how to do it with Rails, and they'll actually add that into the Rails code as they're adding features and things that they need for their own product. So I'm pretty much going to just read through this and stop after each section. There's 9 sections. I think we'll end up being about the perfect amount of time because it's not. Somebody want to say something? I hear somebody. Or there's more people here now. So yeah, it's not like page or from the left, all the way from the left, all the way to the right. So it should go quick. And I think DHH's words are better than I could summarize it, which is really why I'm just going to read it for the most part. But yeah, I think understanding why and kind of the philosophy sum of Rails will make it easier to use Rails. But yeah, let's get going with it. So Ruby on Rails had a phenomenal rise to prominence. It could say to novel technology and timing. It really was something that came at the exact right time for what was needed. And technology advantages erode over time, and good timing doesn't sustain movements over the long term by itself. So a broader explanation of how Rails has continued to not only stay relevant, but to grow its impact and community is needed. So DHH proposes that the enduring enabler has been and remains its controversial doctrine, which you could ask Avi, he'll tell you people either hate or love Rails because it is controversial in how it does some things. So the doctrine has evolved over the past decade. This is the first time I've seen it, but I guess it's been written and updated. But most of the strongest pillars are still the same. And he makes no claim to the fundamental originality of these ideas, just the accomplishment of Rails was to unite and create a strong tribe around a wide set of thoughts about the nature of programming and programmers. So it really was the community that created Rails and pushed Rails to where it is and where it has been. I think that's a reason why we're so strong on community and building the community, because it's a powerful thing. So 9 most important pillars. Optimize for programmer happiness. Convention over configuration. The menu is omakase. I looked up that word so I could say it correctly, and I still might have said it wrong. No one paradigm. Exalt beautiful code. Provide sharp knives. Value integrated systems. Progress over stability, and push up a big tent. So optimizing for programmer happiness. So what was it, 15 years ago, 14 years ago, when Rails was introduced? It was a lot different world, but there would be no Rails without Ruby. So it's only fitting that the first doctrinal pillar is lifted straight from the core motivation for creating Ruby. The core motivation for Ruby is to be designed for programmer happiness. And that was originally what made it something that was very controversial. Other languages had optimized for other conditions, not for programmer happiness. So in Python, there might be one and only one way to do something. Ruby, there are multiple ways sometimes. And that is welcome in Ruby. It's frustrating for some when you can have 2 methods that do the exact same thing, but that's part of what makes Ruby Ruby. It values different things, and most of these things were in service of this yearning for programmer happiness. So something that brought it at odds with programming environments, but also made a lot of programmers happy and has developed a very strong core of Ruby backers, I guess, community, people that really love working in Ruby. I think you find that even when you don't like Ruby too much because you've done something else, after writing Ruby for a while, when you go to a different language, you're like, man, I kind of miss what Ruby did here and how it did this and how it did that. So this alternate view for programming and programmers is what DHH says created his love affair with Ruby. And it was a vision, it was counterculture, it was something different than the norm. And that's what really connected with him, he says. So he says Ruby transformed him in his life and was a deep revelation. So he wanted to create something because of that. Like, he wanted to be like Matz, who created Ruby. So to connect this to Rails, it's instructive to look at another principle that was often used to describe Ruby in the early days, and that is the principle of least surprise. So Ruby typically, for the most part, behaves how you'd expect it to. So if we look at the two, in IRB, if you boot up IRB and you hit exit, you're out of it. If you hit quit, you're out of it. If you're in Python and you type exit, it's going to tell you that you have to use exit with parentheses. You have to call a function, or you have to do Control D to get out of the Python. I forget what it's called, but they have Python's equivalent to IRB. It has a specific name. So Ruby accepts both exit and quit because they both make sense. That's something that a lot of other languages would say is craziness, you know? So Python, on the other hand, pedantically instructs the programmer how to properly do what's requested, even though it obviously knows what is meant. since it's displaying the error message. So it's kind of saying like, okay, Python, you know what I'm trying to do. Why don't you just do it? Why are you telling me to do something different? And that's a big difference between the two. So with that, to connect to Rails, again, this similar principle of least surprise and what the Rails community calls the principle of the bigger smile, which is just what it says it is. APIs designed with great attention paid to whatever would make me smile more and broader, in DHH's opinion. So he says it sounds narcissistic, and it does, but it's hard to argue against the first impression. And I guess it's easy to argue against it when there isn't a lot of, you can't make a lot of comparison, but over time, I think it does get harder to argue against. So he talks about trying to figure out how to make it, and then he at times went to silly lengths to serve his principle. Another example is less implementation effort, but triggered almost as much was, I'm looking at here, array 2nd through 5th and 42 for good trolling measure. These alias accessors were deeply offensive to a very vocal constituency who described the bloat of something that could as well be written as 1, 2, 41. So people were mad that, they're like, why are we using this whole word? We can just do that, that makes more sense. But it's logical, it's maybe not the most efficient to do both, or, it's not, I guess, logical to do both, but it's a principle ingrained in Rails. So unlike, say, optimizing for performance, it's tough to measure optimizing for happiness. And I think that's where a lot of things get lost in translation. It's one of those things where it's, why is there map and select? Why are they both there? Why is there, find and find by and find with? And it's because it makes people happy. It's an unscientific endeavor, but it can be outright frustrating too. And as programmers, we're taught to argue and conquer things that are measurable. So it's one of those hard things to even figure out how to do it. But it is easy to measure in a grand scheme of things. And that comes from the Ruby on Rails community. As you meet more people who are in it and have been in it, people who write Ruby and write Rails really love doing it. I can personally say I don't think I've ever met someone who's writing Rails and does it daily, and it's what they do and really doesn't want to do it. It's like it's very few and far between that I've met somebody, and typically I haven't met them in person. They've been on a Slack channel somewhere, if ever, that they're like, whenever I come across a project with Ruby, I don't like it. It's very few people who fall into that camp. And that's because of how it's designed. Next is convention over configuration. I think this is the biggest thing that people stumble with and that they have problems with. We want to be able to make Rails do what we want it to do. And that's not how Rails works. Rails has convention. One of the early productivity models of Rails went, you're not a beautiful and unique snowflake. It postulated that by giving up vain individuality, you can leapfrog the toils of mundane decisions and make faster progress in areas that really matter. So it's the trade-off. It's, okay, I might want it to be, like the example here, does it really matter whether it's ID, post ID, or PID? No. So Rails says, this is how we're going to do it. And we don't care what you think. And you're going to do it the way that we say, because we believe that this decision is not worth spending the time figuring out or discussing or arguing about. Because if 3 people on the team want 3 different things, now you have to make a decision on that. So you know what? If you use Rails, that decision's taken out of your hands. And this can drive some people crazy about Rails. It's one of the things that I know a lot of people dislike about Rails. They can't change these things. And it's part of using Rails. Swing its machete at the thick and ever-growing jungle of recurring decisions that face developers creating information systems for the web. There are thousands of decisions that just need to be made once, and if someone else can do it for you, all the better. And some people really like that. Some people don't. But the idea that, database keys and some method names and things like that are taken care of for you definitely is one of the reasons why Rails is still one of the main things that startups use, that companies that want to iterate quickly use. They know that, okay, we're not going to have to worry about our developers arguing about these things. We're not going to have to worry about any new developers we bring in having to learn these new things, because so many things are going to be convention. And they're not going to be configured. They're not going to be chosen. They're going to just be what they are. But yes, not only does the transfer of configuration to convention free us from deliberation, it also provides a lush field to grow deeper abstractions. We can depend on a person class mapping to people table. We can use that same inflection to map an association declared as has many people to look for a person class. The power of good convention is that they pay dividends across a wide spectrum of use. But beyond that productivity, convention always lowers the barrier of entry for beginners. There are so many conventions in Rails that a beginner doesn't even need to know about, but can just benefit from an ignorance. It's possible to create great applications without knowing why everything is the way it is, which is really powerful. That's not possible if your framework is merely a thick textbook and your new application is a blank piece of paper. It takes immense effort to figure out where and how to start. Half the battle of getting going is finding a thread to pull. And I don't know if you've ever looked at documentation for some other frameworks, but they're like that. It's like, okay, here's a how-to, and let's build this app, and I'll follow it step by step. And then you're still kind of puzzled at the end, or not even kind of, you just are puzzled. Same goes even when you understand how all the pieces go together. When there's an obvious next step for every change, we can get through the many parts of an application in the same or very similar to all the other applications that went before it. So everything's in its place. We know, if we're looking for routes, they're always in config. They're always set up the same way. We can read through it. We can understand it. It's easy to think of every aspect of an application that can be formed from pre-cut templates, but that is not what makes the best applications. They need to be unique in some way. So he's saying here, the hard part is knowing when to stray from the convention. And the convention is, it's been established over years. It's 14 years old now. This said 12 years, and it was 2006, but it was earlier in the year. So I think it's at 13 years now, the age, or 14 years, the age of Rails. So these are things that, have been developed and figured out over time. So it's even harder for us who are starting to know when to stray from convention. So take those steps with caution. If you choose to try and step outside of what Rails wants you to do, it can be perilous. I know people who have worked in Rails for much longer than me who will tell you the same thing. And really, it's about being very careful when you step outside of those conventions and understanding exactly kind of what you're trying to accomplish, and if it's going against the convention or not, because it's there for a reason. So the menu. I'm not going to keep saying that word wrong because I'm just going to stumble over it. But the analogy is, how do you know what to order in a restaurant when you don't know what's good? First time you've been in, you look at a menu and you're like, what should I eat? Well, if you let the chef choose, you probably can assume a good meal even before you know what quote unquote good is considered inside that restaurant. It requires no expert knowledge on our part at all, or blind luck. It's, trusting someone who knows better. Excuse me. And this is what is being said. When we use convention over configuration, we're doing sort of the same thing. This is the choices of which frameworks and how they fit together. So instead of presenting all the tools and saying, hey, let's just, fit them together however we want and let's pick everything every time, the idea is convention over configuration is occupied with how we best use these individual frameworks. And then the omakase is concerned with which frameworks and how they fit together. So you've probably heard the phrase, use the best tool for the job. And it sounds like it's kind of beyond debate, but the best tool is going to be different for everybody depending on their foundation. So this can be much harder than it seems. So it's similar to the restaurant analogy. However, it can't be done in a box in isolation. And the objective in both cases is to consider the whole system. The analogy here says an eight course meal versus a framework. So we have to consider the whole evening's meal versus or the whole system. So in Rails, there is a diminish of a programmer's individual privilege to choose each tool for a greater one, which is a better toolbox for all. This connecting to the convention as well, where decisions are made for us. But these are the reasons why. And there's safety in numbers. When people are using Rails in the same default ways, we have a shared experience. This common ground makes it much easier to teach and help people. It lays the foundation for debate. I lost my spot. On approach. We all watched the same show last night at 7, so we can all talk about it the next day. It fosters a stronger sense of community. So saying that, if we're all using the same exact tools and building the same sort of things with them, then we can iterate quicker. As a community, we can answer each other's questions. We can make things better. We can all work together as one, or as, I'll just go with like the JavaScript world, which has a ton of people in it. So I don't think you're ever going to find like a specific technology that doesn't have a strong group of people around it. But you might have a problem finding, well, we're running a node server with this database, with this ORM, with this front end, with this, router, and this is our stack. Like in Rails, you don't have that, or not nearly as much, because there's the toolbox is set for the most part. And number two, people are perfecting the same basic toolbox. As a full stack framework, Rails has a lot of moving parts, and how those work together is an important is as important as what they do in isolation, but much of the pain in software comes not from the individual components, but from their interaction. If you've set up your local development environment, you've probably experienced this. It's not we're all installing the same things, but somehow, something about the parts fitting together, it might not work exactly the same on my computer as it does on your computer. When we all work on alleviating shared pain from components that are configured and fail in the same ways, then we all experience less pain. So just in numbers on the same thing, substitutions are still possible, but not required. When Rails is an omakase stack, it still allows you to replace certain frameworks or libraries with alternatives. It just doesn't require you to, which means you can delay those decisions until you've developed a clear personal palette that may prefer the occasional difference. So this is like the final projects in this program in Flatiron School, and Learn. We could do our final projects as, full stack Rails apps, but instead we're doing, a Rails backend with a React front end. There's been a substitution made in one of the layers of the framework, of the stack, in a way that has been done deliberately and isn't required. So the decision wasn't forced to be made. It was something that, we could say, okay, let's develop this. And this does happen a lot, is, a startup will get something going with Rails because they can have it built quickly and get, an MVP, a minimal viable product out there, and have something up and running and working and, starting to acquire customers. And then, they get, that second or third round of funding. And then they say, okay, now we have a solid base of some customers and they want these features, but, okay, now let's look at where we might want to optimize something or replace something or build something a little bit differently. And they might pull out, the front end and turn it into React or whatever the task might be for something that they're doing. Or they might not. They might just leave it as Ruby on Rails, which is fine too. Because even the most learned and skilled programmers who come to and stay in Rails aren't likely opposed to all matters of the menu. If they were, they probably wouldn't have stuck with Rails. So they pick their substitutions with diligence and then go on to enjoy the rest of the curated shared stack alongside everyone else. It does just make life easier when everyone's using the same thing. As you continue on in your programming journey and careers, I think you'll see that almost all the questions you could have about Rails are out there and answered already somewhere. And I think the Rails guides are solid, and I think Ruby docs are really solid because they're mature and they've been around for a while. Like something I hear people talking about is like React Router, which you'll learn about in JavaScript and use. It has been refactored completely like 3 times. It's on version 4, and version 2, 3, and 4 all work completely differently, which means if you upgraded from one to the next, your site would break. Like, that doesn't happen in Rails. Not completely, at least, and not without warning. Like, if you're using Rails 5.0 anything, it's throwing you a lot of warnings and a lot of things about things that were changed in 5.1 that would break. It's very verbose and gives you lots of warning and lots of clear upgrade paths. Okay, no one paradigm. There's a strong emotional appeal to picking a single central idea and following it to the logical conclusion as your architectural underpinning. There's a purity in such discipline, so it's clear why programmers are naturally attracted to this bright light. Rails isn't like that. It isn't a single perfect cut of cloth. It's a quilt, a composite of many different ideas and even paradigms, many that would usually be seen in conflict if contrasted alone and one by one. But that's not what we're trying to do. It isn't a single championship of superior ideas where a sole winner must be declared. Take the templates we build the view in our Rails MVC pie with. By default, all the helpers that allow us to extract code from these templates are just a big pot of functions. It's a single namespace even. The shock and horror. It's like a PHP soup. But DHH contends that PHP had it right when it came to presenting individual functions that really needed to interact, as in with the abstraction in view templates. So this is a reasonable, not only, it's more than reasonable, it's great. So this doesn't mean that we won't use things that are more object-oriented when building views. Concept of presenters, where many are wrapped and interdependent with each other and the data below it, can be much better than a soup, as it's called, turned sour by dependencies. But it generally proved to be rare. So the model in the MVC layer is a prime bastion of object-oriented goodness. So finding the right names for the objects and increasing the coherence and lowering the coupling is the fun of the modeling in this instance. So it's a very different layer from the view, so it takes a very different approach. So saying that, you know, okay, in the views, it makes sense to do things one way, but in the models, it makes sense to do things completely differently. So even though, you know, we have an overarching target of how we want to do things when, you know, targeting programmer happiness, we're going to do the things that make the most sense in the most place in each section of the application, even if it means that we're doing things differently than a different section of the application, if that's making sense. So there isn't a single paradigm. Rails concerns the specialization of Ruby's mix-ins are often used to give the individual models a very wide surface area. This fits well with the active record pattern by giving the concerned methods direct access to the data and storage they interact with. Even the very foundation of the active record framework offends people, where there's interfacing with the database directly inside of business logic, inside of the business domain and logic, and you know, we're mashing the things together. How can this be? But it was the best way, the most practical way to do the things that, you know, we're always talking to the database. It's like, hey, you know, the model is how we connect to the database and do things. So why are we not just going to put the logic there? And that is what allows Rails to tackle so many different problems. As DHH says, to be so ideologically flexible. So some paradigms work really well in their specific scope. However, being too rigid would be counterproductive as well. So many overlapping paradigms can cover all different sides and all different tasks. So the final framework is far stronger and more capable than any individual paradigm would have allowed it to be. There is a conceptual overhead. There has to be a give and take in these decisions. So having multiple paradigms that overlap is going to make it a little bit harder to get to know Rails. You have to know more than just being an object-oriented programming. You need to know procedural and functional as well. So if you start looking at our curriculum, you'll see, oh, like procedural doesn't make, in my mind, procedural doesn't make much sense in how it fits into making web apps. Like, I did it and I was like, I can't see how this is ever going to serve me when I'm building a web application. Like this, I get it's useful and it does stuff, but like, what does this have to do with like putting words on a web page? So the thought process is because of the way Rails works, and it's needed. And this works the same way with Rails not trying to keep everything in Ruby, you know? If you've been through the SQL section of the curriculum, or even the ORM section of the curriculum, Active Record is Rails, you know, it's what Rails uses, yet you might have to write some raw SQL sometimes. And that's also something that can be very frustrating, that you have to do those things. Thanks. I can say that vocab was never my strong one. It was always math. So making it easy to get started, but having that power also is a great balance. You can level up quickly, and as long as you accept the learning as part of the journey, it's awesome. Exalt beautiful code. So this is something that I actually was talking about recently. But we write code not just to be understood by the computer or other programmers, but to bask in a warm glow of beauty. Well, maybe not the beauty part, just we write code to be understood by other programmers too. So aesthetically pleasing code is a value unto itself and should be pursued with vigor. That doesn't mean that beautiful code always trumps other concerns, but it should have a full seat at the table of priorities. So what is beautiful code? In Ruby, it's often somewhere at the intersection between native Ruby idioms and the power of a custom domain-specific language. It's a fuzzy line, but one well worth trying to dance. Here's a simple example from Active Record. Class project inherits from application record, belongs to account, has many participants, class name person, validates presence of name, and this looks like a domain-specific language, but it's really just a class definition with 3 class method calls that take symbols and options. There's nothing fancy here, but it sure is pretty. It sure is simple. It gives an immense amount of power and flexibility from those few declarations. Part of the beauty comes from these calls honoring the previous principles like convention over configuration. When we call belongs to account, we're assuming that the foreign key is called account ID and that it lives in the projects table. When we have to designate the class name of person to the role of the participants association, we require just that class name definition. From it, we'll derive, again, the foreign keys and other configuration points. So if there wasn't the convention in Rails, this would be possible, but it would all have to be defined somewhere. So you couldn't just, like all these assumptions, assuming that the foreign key is called account ID, that would have to be defined somewhere. And that is the configuration that we don't have to do because of the convention. So even when we fight against the convention or are frustrated by the convention, I think it's because we don't realize how much the convention is doing for us. Here's another example. Class create accounts inherits from active record migration. Method change, create table, accounts due, table integer, queen bee ID, table timestamp, send it in. So this is the essence of framework power. Programmer declares a class according to a certain convention. So we're saying this class is inheriting from active record migration. So it's like, hey, follow the active record migration convention. And that implements change. And the framework can do all the plumbing that goes around that and know that this is the method to call. This leaves us with very little code to write. It's true. It might not seem like it as you're going through it, especially the first time. But I think if you do database stuff or just work in a different framework in the future, a full stack framework, React is just a library, so it doesn't do back-end stuff that I know of, then you'll see the differences more. This leaves us very low code to write. In the case of migrations, not only will this allow a call to Rails DB migrate to upgrade the database to add this new table, it will also allow it'll also allow it to go the other way of dropping this table with another call. This is different than making all this happen and stitching the workflow together from libraries they call themselves. So sometimes it's more subtle. It's less about making something as short or as powerful as possible, more about making the rhythm of the declaration flow. So these two statements do the same thing. If people include person, if person in people. But the flow and focus is subtly different. In the first statement, the focus is on the collection. So we're saying, if people includes the person. So we're thinking about the people, the group, and is this person in that group? In the second statement, the subject is clearly the person. So if this person is a part of the group people. So there's not much difference in length, but DHH contends that the second is far more beautiful and likely to make me smile when used in a spot where the condition is about the person. Which I guess makes sense. And that's a personal preference. But I think, I would probably prefer the first one, just me personally. But I could see how being able to, in the right context, having that option makes sense. I don't think I'd ever find it or change it or flip it around. But I definitely know where logic and how these kind of comparisons are made, if done in a way that makes sense to the code around it, makes things way easier to understand. Like I worked on some stuff once and everything was done negatively. So it was like, if not person, and if not this, and if not this. And I was like, why not? Can't we just say if this, like the opposite? Let's keep everything in the positive. And that was just my preference. So provide sharp knives. Ruby includes a lot of sharp knives in its drawer of features, not by accident, but by design. The most famous is monkey patching, the power to change existing classes and methods. This can be bad. I know we shouldn't do it typically if we don't have to. This power has frequently been derided as simply too much for mere mortal programmers to handle. People from more restrictive environments used to imagine all sorts of calamities that would doom Ruby because of the immense trust the language showed its speakers with this feature. If you can change anything, what is there to stop you from overwriting string capitalized so that something bold dot capitalized returns something bold rather than something bold? And like you can do that. You can change any method in Ruby and make it do whatever you want. However, the risk is that might work in your local application, but then breaks all sorts of auxiliary code that depend on the original implementation. It also is going to confuse anybody else who tries to work on your code or read it. So nothing is the answer. There's nothing pragmatically in Ruby to stop you from doing this. However, we enforce such good senses by convention, by nudges, and through education, not by banning sharp knives from the kitchen and insisting everyone use spoons to slice tomatoes. So these things are there for those very, very specific use cases. Using the right scalpel to attack the proper problem is going to be so much better than not having the scalpel available to you. Because the flip side of monkey patching is the power to do such feats of wonder as 2.days.ago, which returns a date 2 days back from the current. Now you might well think that's a bad trade, that you'd rather lose 2 days ago if it means preventing programmers from overwriting string capitalized. If that's your position, Ruby's probably not for you. Yet it'd be hard, even for people who would give up such freedom for some security, to argue that the power to change core classes and methods has doomed Ruby as a language. The language has flourished exactly because it offered a different and radical perspective on the role of the programmer, that they could be trusted with sharp knives. I think scalpels make a better illustration than a sharp knife, but that's me. And not only trusted, but taught to use the tools. And I believe that Avi talks about it in his videos, using the right tool for the job and knowing that. And that just takes time. So don't worry if you wonder how do I know what the right tool for the job is if I don't know all the tools? It comes with time and with training and with education, like is being said here. We could assume that most programmers would want to become better programmers. I think that can be said of all of us, you know? So we're capable of wielding sharp knives without cutting off our fingers, you know, because we learn and we're cautious and we want to understand and have people teach us how to use sharp knives. We don't just go out and do it. Because it's always about other programmers when the value of sharp knives is contested. I've yet to hear a single programmer put up their hand and say, I can't trust myself with this power, please take it away from me. It's always, I think other programmers will abuse this. And that's interesting to think about. So the knives provided in Rails are not nearly as sharp as those offered with the language for obvious reasons. You know, the language is the kind of base core, but some are still pretty keen to cut. And Rails makes no apologies for offering those things. And, you know, having faith that other programmers will learn them properly and use them. Plenty of features in Rails have been contested over time as being too much freedom. For one example that's currently in vogue is the feature of concerns. Thin layer of syntactic sugar around Ruby's built-in feature and modules that is designed to allow a single class to encapsulate multiple related but independently understood concerns, hence the name. The charge is that concerns provide programmers prone to bloat their objects with a whole new set of drawers to stuff their cluttering. That's not true. Concerns can indeed, and that's true, concerns can indeed be used like that. And this is just talking about structuring code and, you know, okay, I'm gonna use concerns so that code in one place looks really, really slim, but it's just because I've taken everything and stuffed it in a concern. And that's where all the work is happening. So it's like, you know, instead of actually cleaning up, we're just stuffing it all in the closet, closing the door. But you can always open the closet door and see it's there. So fallacy is thinking that by not providing a feature like concerns, then we'd put programmers on the path to, you know, doing things the right way, or quote unquote architectural bliss. So it's like, if we didn't have a closet, would that mean that people would you know, just pick up the right way? No, you know, you provide the closet as a tool to put the proper things in, and that helps, you know, make things better all over. But you have to be taught and learn and understand and want to know, you know, where to put those things. Ruby on Rails is an environment for chefs and those who wish to become chefs. You might start out doing the dishes, but you can work your way up to running the kitchen. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't be trusted with the best tool in the trade as part of the journey. And I think that's an awesome metaphor for what, you know, what we're doing. We're starting somewhere, but being provided the tools, and we want to learn to be, you know, that person who understands them all and can use them all. Value integrated systems. Rails can be used in many contexts, but its first love is the making of integrated systems, majestic monoliths, a whole system that addresses an entire problem. This means Rails is concerned with everything from the front-end JavaScript needed to make live updates to how the database is migrated from one version to another in production. It is a very broad scope, but no broader than to be realistic to understand for a single person. Rails specifically seeks to equip generalist individuals to make these full systems. Its purpose is not to segregate specialists into small niches and then require whole teams of such in order to build anything of enduring value. Going back to, you know, the startups with, you know, building MVPs, they got a 10-year Rails developer as their first and only developer. They can get something up and running and going because this person's going to know how to get databases going, how to do a backend, how to set up an API, how to get, you know, their route set up, how to get their front end looking good, how to get, you know, authentication done. It's going to be a generalist. Is this focus on empowering the individual that points to the integrated system? It's in the integrated system we can cut out many needless abstractions, reduce the duplication, between layers like templates on both the server and the client. And above all, avoid distributing our system before we absolutely positively have to. Much of the complication in systems development comes from introducing new boundaries between the elements that restrict how you make calls between A and B. Method calls between objects is far simpler than remote procedure calls between microservices. There's a whole new world of hurt and failure states, latency issues, and dependency update schedules that await those who venture into the layer of distribution. So saying, I've got something up, I'm using Amazon, and I'm using a remote database, and I've got JavaScript on the front end that's going to make a call, and then it's going to have a promise that has to wait for something to come back. And while it's waiting, we want to render something. And then when it comes back, we're going to render something different. And, all these things happen. But when we have a full stack Ruby on Rails app, it's all there. It's, we don't have to worry about these things. Sometimes distribution is simply necessary. It is true. If you want to create an API to your web application that other people can call over HTTP, well, then you just have to suck it up and deal with many of these issues. Although handling requests inbound rather than sending them outbound is much easier, your downtime is someone else's failure state. But that's at least a limited amount of damage inflicted on your own personal development experience. What's worse is when systems are prematurely disintegrated and broken into services, or even worse, microservices. This drive frequently starts from the misconception that if you want a modern internet application, as they're being called, you'll simply have to build the system many times over. Once on the server, once on the JavaScript MVC client side, once for each of the native mobile applications, and so forth. That is not a law of nature. It needn't be so. And that's true. It is just one of those things I think some people accept, but there are different ways to do things, and Rails is different. All this you can do, you can share large chunks of the entire application. You can use the same controllers and views for desktop web as for mobile apps, as for your API endpoints. It's an integrated system. That's, you don't have to give up much, if anything, if done right, in terms of speed, user experience, or other attributes that falsely draw developers to premature distribution. Rails can be, I think the biggest thing you hear about Rails in general is it's not fast enough. When Rails is done right, it is ridiculously fast. There are faster things, that is true, depending on what you're using the tool for, and there are some better tools for specific things. And understanding the tools is part of it. That's the have most of it all we seek. All the power of the individually tuned and distributed applications with the ease of use and understanding of a single integrated system. I think this is the last one. Oh, no, two more, and we'll be done here soon. Progress over stability. When your systems have been around for more than a decade, like Rails has, and there's kind of very few other frameworks that can say that, natural tendency is toward ossification. There are a million reasons why every change might be an issue for someone, somewhere, who depended on past behavior, and fair reasons, those are too for the individual. So like if somebody built something on Rails 5 years ago and you're changing it now, it's gonna break. So kind of, thinking about how do you upgrade gracefully. But if we listen too closely to conservatism, we'll never see what's on the other side. We have to dare occasionally to break and change how things are to evolve and grow. Is this evolution that will keep Rails fit for survival and prosperity in the decades to come? It's looking at Rails like 5.1 now, is it? Where, you can generate a Rails project and use a Webpacker flag and have Webpack built in, or the Webpacker gem built in, and all of your JavaScript assets are already taken care of and put through a Webpacker build process. Like, Rails isn't trying to go stale at all. It's, like they said, much harder to swallow in practice, because doing those things are also breaking some things along the way. Especially when it's your application that breaks from a backwards incompatible change in a major version of Rails. We need to remember the value of why these changes are being made, and progress over stability sometimes. And we can fix it. That's what we do. It's not a license to inflict needless hurt willy-nilly. The great Rails migration of 2.x to 3 still lingers in the scar tissue of many who were around for that. It was a tough one. A serious upheaval that left many behind in 2.x land for a long time. Some soured beyond convincing. I've definitely heard people who had to do Rails 2 to Rails 3 and they really didn't. Yeah, they talked badly about it. However, hard bargains that need to continue to be made. If Rails is going to be better off in 5 years for the changes we make today, we have to do things, and things are going to be changed. So it happens. It happens in other languages too, and other frameworks for sure, but I think Rails handles it well. Also has to happen in Ruby, and I know things break in Ruby because I've used Ruby, the wrong Ruby version with things, and they haven't worked. And that's part of what Rails does. It helps Ruby's progress by driving the people who use Rails to adopt later versions faster. Move to Ruby 1.6, 8, 2.2, 2.3, lots of major changes along the way. Rails was there to have Ruby's back and help everyone get with the program faster. So Rails forces people to upgrade their Ruby versions. Rails loves Ruby, as DH8 said, so they're pushing people to move forward with it. Bundler was once a controversial idea, but Rails pushed it to the front. Bundler was the first thing like it. Now there's NPM out there and Yarn and I don't know, what is it? I think pip is what PHP uses. But like things, the asset pipeline had never been thought about before. And now there's build tools like Gulp and Grunt and all doing these types of things, and the persistent command process. And these things were, revolutionary, from my understanding. Progress is ultimately mostly about people and their willingness to push change. This is why there are no lifetime seats in groups like Rails Core and Rails Committers. Both groups are for those who are actively working on making progress for the framework. There are some languages that go through rough times or projects at least, because of the people that sit on some of the committees, because we don't think about it, but there's groups of people that control this stuff. Likewise, it's why it's so important for us to continue to welcome and encourage new members of the community. We need fresh blood and fresh ideas to make better progress. And I've found the Ruby community, at least my local one, to be super helpful and welcoming. It's nice. I found the whole developer community to be nice where I am, and very helpful and willing to help. But Ruby's very much like that, I think, around everywhere, because of how it's designed and what its core kind of beliefs are. Push up a big tent. With so many controversial ideas to its credit, Rails could quickly become an insular group of ideological hermits if we required everyone to exhibit complete deference to all tenets all the time, so we don't. We need disagreement, we need dialects, we need diversity of thought and people. It's in this melting pot of ideas we'll get the best comments for all to share. Lots of people chipping in their 2 cents in code or considered argument. So while this doctrine has described an idealized form, the everyday reality is much more nuanced and interesting. Rails is capable of supporting such a large community under one tent exactly because there are so few, if any, litmus tests. The continued success of RSpec, a DSL for testing, I've often expressed grave discontent with, is perfect proof. So RSpec, like the #1 testing framework for Rails, Ruby, is something that the guy who created Rails doesn't like, which I think is kind of funny. I can rant until I'm blue in the face of why I don't think it's the way to go, and it can still blossom and prosper. That point is the far more important one. So like, it's not like there's centralized control. Like, a lot of people listen to DHH and what he says, yet he said so many times how much he doesn't like this, and everybody else does. So it's like, it's done its thing. The same is true for the advent of Rails as an API. While his personal focus and dedication is to the integrated system that includes the view, people want to use Rails as a backend API endpoint, like we learned how to do. And people want to use single page applications, JavaScript client side to do the front end, and they want Rails to sit on the back and be an endpoint. And so Rails does it. We should embrace this in as much as it can coexist as a secondary mission. I believe it surely can. Having a big tent doesn't mean trying to be all things to all people, though. Just means you welcome all people to your party and allow them to bring their own drinks. We need to lose none of our soul or values by offering others to join us, and we may well learn how to mix a new delicious drink or two. It doesn't come for free. It requires work to be welcoming. It's true. Especially if your goal isn't just to attract more people who are just like the ones who are already part of the community. Lowering the barriers to entry is work we should always take seriously. You never know when the next person who starts just fixing a misspelling in the documentation ends up implementing the next great feature, but you stand a chance to find out if you smile and say thank you for whatever small contribution that gets the motivation flowing. So just overall Rails community kind of kick to, being welcoming, being positive, being warm to people, especially new people, because you never know who's going to do what. I think you can see that. I know Avi has a decent little list in his head. I don't think it's published anywhere, but if you look at some things that like some Flatiron alums have gone on to do, like they were sitting here knowing nothing and went through a program and now are doing amazing things. But yeah, that's kind of the overall Rails doctrine. I think it helps some with working with Rails when you understand the core principles around it and why it does some of the things it does. And I think it makes it less frustrating when you understand why, some things are allowed or done a certain way, or specific words have to be used in certain places. So yeah, that's that. Hope you enjoy it. Hope it was helpful. Read through this document. How do I, if you want. There. It's good. I'll put it in the chat. I think it's worth going through or bookmarking, because I'm sure he updates it from time to time. It's right here on Ruby's on rails.org. But yeah, that's all I got for this evening.